My name is Camelia. I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford. And I'd like to share with you some work focused on ransomware. This is joint work with Joe Bono, Chris Gates, and Sharad Goel. So as you might know, ransomware is a type of malware that restricts access to a computer, typically by locking the computer or encrypting data and demanding payment to restore access. So there's been a lot of media attention focused on ransomware in recent years. This has been in large part due to or driven by attacks on government organizations and high-profile industry targets. However, it's thought that consumers are actually the most targeted and at risk, in part because they may have less robust security in place to protect them. For example, a report by Symantec has found that two-thirds of all blocked infections of ransomware have been on the consumer side for the past couple of years. But very little is known about the prevalence and characteristics of these attacks on the general population, what proportion of people pay, how they perceive and react to these attacks. Various government organizations, researchers, and industry have attempted to document the phenomenon, but results have often been inconsistent and difficult to compare against and generalize to the general population. And this is in part based on, due to the fact that non-representative data has been used. So government organizations, such as the FBI's IC3 organization, relies on voluntary victim reports, and this is thought to be a gross underestimate of the true rate. Industry will report blocked infection rates of the users of their software products. And of course, these are users who self-select into purchasing a software security product and may not be representative of the general population. More recently, researchers have turned to public crypto transactions to try and estimate losses and infection rates. So for example, Huang et al. Find 20,000 potential victims globally who paid ransom using Bitcoin. But of course, this, one obvious limitation here is that it's limited to one payment method, which again is not a complete picture of what's going on. So we focused in this work on answering two questions. First, what is the prevalence of ransomware for the general population? How many people are infected? And second, can we predict who is at risk, so who the vulnerable population is? And to do so, we developed a survey tool that we administered to a representative sample of the US population. The survey documented the characteristics of the ransomware attack experienced, but also situational and behavioral factors that may have led to susceptibility. Okay, so I'll first focus on estimating prevalence. We had a representative sample of 1,200 US adults from YouGov. YouGov is a global market research firm that has over 2 million members subscribed in the US, and they do make an effort to have on their panel hard-to-reach populations. And each weighting adjustment, so each respondent had a weighting adjustment associated with them, and which was constructed by matching to the 2010 American Community Survey. And this is a standard technique to adjust for any remaining bias in the convenience sample. Respondents progressed through up to 30 information and question pages. We first provided them with a definition of ransomware, screenshots of common strengths, such as the one you see on the right. We asked them 5 questions on specific tactics that are typically seen in ransomware attacks. So these might be things like, did you see a timer counting down? Was your screen locked? Did you notice that your files were encrypted? And things like that. And of course, do you see impersonation of law enforcement agencies, such as the FBI? We also asked them for a free text description of what happened. So tell us what happened in your own words. And consequences of the attack. So how did they remove the ransomware? Were they able to? Did they pay? And how did they react? Now, as is the case with most surveys, our results are limited by the fact that these are self-reports, and so we can't know for sure that respondents correctly identified ransomware as such. We did try to mitigate these issues in a variety of ways, one of which was to pilot the survey on Mechanical Turk prior to running the study and making edits and clarifications as needed. And of course, so having access to this fairly extensive list of questions also allowed us to make sure that respondents' answers were in fact consistent and tease out any, allowing us to further verify that their answers were in fact incidents of ransomware. So initially we found that 5% of respondents self-identified as victims. Each of these responses was manually reviewed and classified, reclassified when necessary by 2 independent researchers. And following reclassification, we found that approximately 3% of users were indeed ransomware victims. So although small, this does correspond to almost 3 million victims in the US, which is, I would say, not insignificant. We found that almost half of the attacks reported included some kind of police impersonation, such as the FBI example you saw previously. Strains that included encryption, that encrypted data, were much less common than locker strains, which are typically easier to remove, so 36% versus 74%. The median and average ransom reported was $250 and $510 respectively. And consistent with prior work, few victims paid the ransom 4% or notified authorities 10%. Now, one hypothesis is that the rise in adoption of cryptocurrencies is really a major driving force behind the ransomware trend that we see. And so we asked respondents, how were you asked to pay the ransom? This was a multiple choice question, so we're able to estimate a lower bound on the distribution of methods. And we found that prepaid cash vouchers and wire transfers together accounted for over 56% of infections, dominating, whereas cryptocurrencies accounted for only 12%. So this result sort of casts doubt on that hypothesis. We also asked respondents, did you change any behaviors following the attack? And we found that half of victims reported changing 2 or more security habits. These were driven by more careful browsing and behaviors related to AV products. So a lot of people either purchased or updated their AV product. Now, whether people actually in fact change their behaviors, or this is due to some kind of social desirability bias that we're seeing, we of course can't know for sure. But it does suggest that people are attributing the cause of the attack, at least in part, to their own behaviors, as opposed to adopting a view of, it was just random, it wasn't my fault, it's just a freak accident that kind of randomly happened to me. One other observation that stood out to us here was that very few respondents started to back up their data following the attack. Now, this is arguably the single most effective way to mitigate against a ransomware attack and avoid paying the ransom, but few people tended to do so, suggesting that maybe more awareness and education is maybe warranted around the security habit. Okay, finally, we looked at risk perceptions. So the idea that, or one's awareness that they are at risk of an adverse security event is thought to play an important role in making the security decisions. So we asked respondents 2 questions to get at this. First, how likely do you think you are to experience a future ransomware attack? And what is the likelihood that if you were to get infected with a ransomware attack, with ransomware today, that and the only way to get your data back would be to pay a ransom of $300, how likely are you to pay that ransom? And respondents were prompted here to report a number, an integer between 1 and 100, where 1 means no and 100 means yes, definitely. And the table shows averages across the victims and non-victims. So we find that victims believe they are more at risk of a future attack and at the same time less likely to pay. So maybe this is due to having better mitigation strategies in place following the attack or changing their habits, but we can't know for sure. And this is one area where it'd be interesting to do further work and really tease out and understand what's driving the differences. Okay, so shifting now to susceptibility. A natural question is, of course, given that the costs of a ransomware infection are pretty high, given in terms of monetary and time, can we identify the at-risk population? So we tried to predict ransomware infection using our survey responses. We had questions on demographics, socioeconomic status, the technology used, so for example, OS type, browser, the computer savviness, which was measured via an 8-question multiple choice test, about 10 to 12 security habits, and a binary indicator of whether or not the respondent had been exposed to an online scam previously. So we fit 2 models, a linear model, the lasso, and a nonlinear model, the gradient boosted trees. And in the table is average AUC across 10 folds, and you can see that results are fairly consistent between the 2 models. So what we found was that after controlling for security habits and online exposure, the situational factors such as demographics and socioeconomic status really didn't hold any predictive power. So this is a nice result, sort of speaking to the power of having good security outcomes. And you can see that the performance is on par with the saturated model using all features. Okay. So having said that, collecting this type of data may be costly and difficult. So we proposed also a simpler approach to risk assessment. And this is a sort of proof of concept risk rubric that consumers can use to estimate their own risk of infection. So it was constructed using the tuned lasso model, and where we rounded and scaled the coefficients to integers from 1 to 10. And it consists of only 6 questions. So these focused on torrent behaviors, backing up and data encryption habits, exposure to online scams, 2-factor authentication usage, and password protection for login habits. And the output is a risk score for each user. The higher the score, the more at risk a user is. Okay, so we wanted to see whether the model was calibrated. In the plot here, you see the scores grouped into buckets of 5. Each point is contains anywhere between 3 to 13 infections, and the sizes indicate the number of users in that dot. And the y-axis is the likelihood of ransomware infection predicted by a model where the sole predictor was this risk score predicted by the risk rubric. And we can see that as the score increases, the likelihood of infection also increases, giving us confidence that the model is indeed calibrated. And of course, we see that we don't really lose anything in terms of predictive performance. Okay, so to conclude, we provide the first representative estimate of ransomware infection for the general population. This was 3% for the year that we measured. And of course, an interesting future work here is whether this number is increasing and at what rate, which will require further longitudinal studies. We also found that susceptibility to ransomware infection can be predicted just from self-reported security habits and exposure to online scams. And finally, we presented a proof of concept approach for consumers to self-assess their risk of infection. So it's fast, transparent, and requires limited information. These are all features that previous work has found to make risk rubrics more acceptable to users. But of course, future research is required to really gauge user reaction to these models and also to robustly test them before they can be responsibly used on the general population. So I'll stop here for questions. Feel free to reach out with any questions or feedback. Thank you.
Hi, Alyssa Red-Miles, Microsoft Research and Princeton. I thought it was interesting that a lot of the predictive questions in the questionnaire were pretty general. Is your hypothesis that predicting ransomware risk would also generalize well to predicting, say, risk of falling for spam or other negative security consequences, or do you think that wouldn't work?
It's a really interesting question. So I'm not sure what to say on the spot here. I would like to think that's true. But at the same time, phishing, for example, comes through different mediums and has become very sophisticated. So yeah, I'm hesitant to say yes, but I would like to say yes.
Thanks.
You alluded to a few ways that ransomware infection rates have been measured, including the Huang 2018 paper. I wonder if you extrapolated your finding of the percentage of attacks that were due to paid through Bitcoin to the other methods you found, if you would get the rough, result in the range of Huang 2018?
Yeah, we did that. The caveat there is that it required various assumptions to kind of line up the numbers. We did that for, I believe, all three of these reports, and the results are in the paper. And we did find that ballpark, they were consistent, but again, it required various assumptions because, for example, the Huang paper only looks at cryptocurrencies and or Bitcoin payments and those that paid. And we had no idea of how to extrapolate like global payment rates. So we used our number. And so there's a lot of caveats to that, which is partly what motivated the work, in that it's very difficult to extrapolate from each of these individual numbers to a generalized estimate. Yep.
Hi, great talk. My question is, the general perception that people have towards their privacy is, I don't have anything to hide, and why would anybody want to attack me, especially ransomware. So if people have such attitude, my question to you then is, what kind of demographics did you see were more prone to such ransomware attacks? Was it a specific age group, or people belonging to a specific economic status or education status, something like that?
So I don't have, so I don't want to speak to that directly, because sort of our results point to the fact that demographics and socioeconomic status weren't at all as predictive, anywhere near as predictive as after taking account these security habits and online scams. So if you look at just comparing the accuracies of these models here, the one with security habits and experience scam pretty much performs like on par with the saturated model, versus demographics and socioeconomic status is 10 percentage point lower accuracy. So I think there's, we found limited, I guess, usability in trying to tease that out given the results.
Within the consequences that you saw, I was wondering if you can tease out something about like how much data did they actually lose? How much did they suffer for it? Just given the low percentage that you saw of people deciding to do backups, which you were thinking might be an awareness issue, but it may also be, you know, if they have all their stuff on cloud services, or if they have an automatic cloud backup that they don't really think of as like, I'm setting up a backup, but so it might.
That's in the paper in terms of the amount of, the number of people that lost data as the result of the attack. I believe, don't quote me on this, but I believe close to 30%, 25% or 30% lost data as a result of the attack. And I think in part that's driven by the main, or the focus being on locker ransomware, which is easier to circumvent than the encryption ransomware. So that may be partly driving the result of not backing up data, but we can't really know for sure. It'd be interesting to follow up on that for sure.
I won't quote you.
Okay, thank you.